All right. Well, over the last few weeks, atheists have been calling into my show, which is amazing, and I love it. And they've been asking a lot about the nature of the soul and presenting arguments and objections against a Christian view that we as people are made of both body and soul. It's been a fun conversation, but I knew I wanted to dive deeper into this. And so I've invited a friend of mine to come on to join me and to have a conversation on the nature of the soul. What is it? Why does it exist? How do we know it's real? And answer any sort of questions you have. He's way smarter than me on this, and so he will answer anything that you can throw at him. His name is Eric Hernandez. He is the apologetics lead and millennial expert with the Texas Baptist Convention, as well as not just a friend. He is my underling, my employee. I'm his boss, and so I told him if he doesn't show up, then he's fired. But in reality, no. He is one of the Maven field guides, and so we were just together in Utah last week on a trip, and so we just been blessed to have him on the field guide team and leading students around the country. And so, Eric, thanks for joining me today on this conversation on the soul. Appreciate it.
Oh yeah, thank you. This is a sole part of my ministry, so I appreciate that.
Yeah. I'm glad that we're going to be able to pick your brain today and kind of answer any questions.
No. We're not going to be picking any brains today. I did not sign up for that.
All right, Micah, that one was for you. So anyways, we want to jump into this conversation and kind of understand it. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you kind of get into apologetics, the ministry that you're doing, and really specializing in the nature and understanding of the soul?
Yeah, great question. To try and give the brief version, essentially, freshman year of college, took my first philosophy class. I just wanted a blow-off class, and I thought philosophy was just making stuff up and sharing your opinion. And I thought, well, I could even skip this class and I'd be fine. But my first professor was an atheist, but very even-handed, and I appreciated what I learned there, and I kind of got hooked to philosophy. Second semester, I want to take another class in philosophy, but everyone warned me that whatever I do not take Professor Pena's class because he's antagonistic and condescending, and his goal will be to try to make me lose my faith. And so my thought was, well, where can I sign up? Obviously not because I wanted to lose my faith, but because I had genuine questions, but at the same time, I knew that if God existed, then all truth would be grounded in him in some way, form, or fashion. And so if something's true, I shouldn't be afraid to learn it. Additionally, I knew that if Christianity were true, I needed to know why, but it also crossed my mind that if Christianity were false, I'd still like to know why, and maybe this was a guy for the job. So the pivotal moment in my life and ministry that not just got me into philosophy and apologetics, but specifically the soul, was one class in particular. He starts the class by pulling out this antidepressant pill from his pocket, and he says, religion wants us to believe in this immaterial soul, and because of this, we have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have passed away before us. And according to Christianity, your thoughts, your emotions, your sensations are supposed to be within this immaterial soul, and these are also supposed to be allegedly immaterial. And then he argued that if that's the case, though, how is it that this tiny antidepressant pill, which is physical, has the power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul? And he said, because if I took this antidepressant pill, it has the ability to change and affect these things. But how can that be? Because whenever scientists look at brain scans, all they find are neurons firing. And when a scientist looks at the body under a microscope, all they find is nothing more than chemistry and physics. And he said, so how do we explain this? And he said, the answer is simple. I'll tell you how. The answer is that there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife, there is no soul. You are just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. Now, what struck me was essentially, to get to the point here, was that first of all, for the first time in my life, I heard an argument against the soul. I didn't know that there were people who didn't believe in the soul. And for the first time in my life, I hear an argument that, if true, would prove Christianity false. How so? To paraphrase Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false, point blank. And Paul goes as far as to say, not only would it be false, but people should actually feel sorry for us for how dumb and gullible we were to believe this stuff to begin with. And so I submit to you that if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection, as the Bible lays it out. And once again, if there's no resurrection, Christianity cannot be true. So there I was, freshman in college, knowing not much of anything about philosophy, didn't know what apologetics was, but I knew that, okay, if my faith is not going to be in vain, if this stuff is true, I need to find an answer to this problem. And long story short, that's what essentially got me into philosophy, and more specifically metaphysics and philosophy of mind, and it's become an area of specialization for me ever since.
Awesome. Now, that's what's wonderful. And I love how these kind of experiences really kind of draw things together, really kind of put us in unique spaces that maybe we wouldn't have seen us in previously. So kind of as we walk into this a little bit, how would you go about just defining it? Start with some basic definitions, kind of what is a soul? How is it different than a brain or a body? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, sure thing. And if you want, I can share my slides here for that. Let me know when they are up, if you're able to put them up.
Yeah, there they are.
Okay, awesome. So what is a soul? To start with some definitions, we'd say that the soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. And we'll focus on these 2 points here of the definition. So whenever I give a case for the soul, there's essentially 2 basic points I make. And the first is that consciousness is not physical, and 2, that I am more than a brain and body. Now, oftentimes, especially if you have atheist listeners, they'll typically jump to saying something like, well, we need science, for this. And the short answer is that this is a wrong tool for the assessment, because this would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. It's simply the wrong tool for the assessment. The soul, if it exists, is non-physical, and science, well, it's a wonderful tool for studying the physical world. It's a tool that is limited to only studying the physical world. So to try and use science to investigate or prove or disprove the soul is simply a category fallacy. So what would be the right tool for this? And it's essentially philosophy, metaphysics. And to unpack this, all my arguments for the soul are going to be using, we can call for short the law of identity, but it's technically Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, but we'll just call it Leibniz's law for short, or law of identity. And it basically states that if 2 things in question are the same, say some A and B, then whatever's true of one is true of the other, and vice versa. So essentially, we'd be using 2 phrases or terms or names for the same thing. So for example, Eric Hernandez and the guest on your show right now are the same person, and thus whatever's true of Eric Hernandez is going to be true of the guest on your show. But in principle, if I can show something true of one that's not true of the other, or vice versa, well, then it shows that they're simply not the same thing. In philosophy, when we say 2 things are identical, we literally mean they're the same thing. But again, using Leibniz's law, if we can show that there's something true of one that is not true of the other, then they're simply not the same thing. Okay, so with this in mind, to my first point, that consciousness is not physical. Let's suppose there is no soul, and something known as physicalism would be true, which is essentially the idea that human beings are identical and reducible to something physical. Now, if the mind exists and if physicalism is true, it would have to be identical and reducible to something like the brain. But again, given Leibniz's law of identity, it would have to be the case that whatever's true of one is true of the other. But to reiterate, if we can find something true of one, not true of the other, they simply can't be the same thing. And this is trivially easy to prove. So for example, take a state of my mind. My thoughts or beliefs, which is a state of my mind, can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. The correlated group of neurons firing when I have a thought is not true or false, but my thoughts are. So that alone would show they're not the same thing. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but no thought of mine weighs 3 pounds. And while the audience may be having heavy thoughts while we go through this presentation, they're not going to need a neck brace after this. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. And while we can go on and on, the point is simply that if all the properties of the mind are not physical and all the properties of the brain are physical, then consciousness, if it exists, cannot be identical or reducible to the physical. So that would immediately get us to some type of dualism, namely that the mind is not something physical, identical, or reducible to the brain. You tell me if you want me to stop or keep going to the next point.
No, I think that's good. So let's stop there for a second, because that's kind of the general case that I will make, is kind of that law of identity, and that the brain is not equal to the mind as far as measurability, as you said there. Whether it's true or false, there's aboutness. Your thoughts are about something. Your brain just is. There's a lot there I think is good. Now, Travis wrote in here. Appreciate it, Travis. Thanks for being here. He says non-physical soul. So science is about novel, testable predictions. Could you think of any test for a soul? So how would you go about this idea of, okay, we want to scientifically know something, we're talking about here's philosophy. How would you kind of respond to this idea of we only know things that's scientifically novel, testable predictions?
So as I alluded to, and this is why I start my presentation by saying it's not a scientific question, because typically this is where most non-believers jump to. And depending on the person, sometimes they're under the assumption of what's called scientism, which is a false view of knowledge. And it's essentially the idea that the only way or the best way to gain knowledge about reality is through science. There's lots of problems with that view, but one problem, just focusing on the epistemology of scientism, is that it is self-defeating. For the person who claims that, let's say, science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality, well, they just made a scientific claim that is not something they arrived through science. In other words, you cannot prove that science is the only way to gain knowledge when that very claim is a philosophical claim, not a scientific claim. So as I say in my book, science is subordinate to philosophy. So that being said, to ask for scientific evidence, quote unquote, for the soul would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. Or another analogy I've heard used, suppose I tell you there's an invisible man in my house and you come over to investigate this. And after 2 hours of searching, you come out and you're really frustrated with me and you accuse me of lying. And I said, Ryan, why would you think I'm lying? And here's your response. You said, because I just looked 2 hours throughout your entire house for this invisible man, and I never saw him once. I looked in the bedroom, in the closet, in the bathroom, and never once did I ever see this invisible man. And of course, my response would be, well, of course you didn't see him. He's invisible. Now, note that what I said in defense doesn't prove I'm right, but it does prove that at the very least, what I'm claiming is logically consistent with what you're trying to use as an objection. So there wouldn't be any, quote, scientific test for the soul, because again, it's simply a category fallacy. Consider atheist Michael Roos. He said, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise that it does not provide certain answers. So there would be no, quote unquote, scientific test, again, to investigate the soul, any more than there wouldn't be any visible test to look for an invisible man. All that to say then, as I said, we go back to metaphysics, philosophy, and what you would do is something that I just did here with the mind and brain. If these two are the same thing, then they're going to share the same properties, and if they don't, simply put, they're not the same thing.
That's good. Now, Travis, I see your comments there, and this is similar to what Eric is talking about, similar to what we discussed in our conversation a few weeks ago, where, again, this idea of everything is scientifically testable is scientism, and we even talked about you holding beliefs that were not scientifically testable, namely that there is no God. And so there's a reason or a way in which we're talking about different categories, or philosophy and science. And so we're going to talk about, as you mentioned there, the link between body and soul in a little bit. But at least at the beginning now, we're trying to walk through this idea of why does this matter, and what is this that we're actually talking about? Now, I do want to address another question, Travis, that you wrote in here really quickly, is, Eric, what would you say is the reason why we're having this conversation? Why is it important? Or as Travis put it, why should we care about a non-scientific entity? So what is it about the nature of the soul that is something that we should take seriously and care about?
It's kind of a silly question, in my opinion. There are a lot of things that are non-scientific we care about. For example, ethics and morality is not a scientific question. Whether or not I should kill people, murder people, or steal, etc., is not a scientific question, and yet we clearly care about it, so much so that we'll be voting in an election coming up to legislate certain laws. So, yeah, I don't see why we wouldn't care about non-scientific things. Second, we should care about truth. We are creatures made to obtain truth, and if something's true, we should care to know it. Second, this goes into the fundamental nature of what we are. This gets into questions of abortion, euthanasia, all kinds of ethical issues depending on what is the nature of who I am. Am I something purely physical? Am I something immaterial? This gets into the question of even free will, and it even bleeds into neuroscience. How so? Well, essentially, if there is no soul, one of my arguments would be that if there's no soul, there's no free will. And if there's no free will, then we cannot be held morally responsible for our actions, nor can anyone claim a sense of rational responsibility for the beliefs they hold to if it's all determined. So, for there to be free will, you need something transcendent to the physical. Now, in addition, here's why it bleeds into neuroscience. You have people, world-leading neuroscientists like Jeffrey Schwartz, who are experts in cognitive behavioral therapy. And long story short, what they've shown is that people with OCD can actually rewire the chemistry of their brain by thinking differently. Now, to note the importance here and the implications, there are things that are causally determined by our biology or brain chemistry, right? Someone with anxiety doesn't choose to be anxious. They're causally determined to be anxious by the chemistry of their brain. But what Jeffrey Schwartz has shown is that by thinking differently, and I won't go through the whole process, you can look him up. He has a couple good books, You Are Not Your Brain, and another one I think called Brain Luck or 4-Step Process. And what he's shown is that by thinking differently, you can rewire the chemistry of your brain. This gets into what's called neuroplasticity. But again, note the implication. In order for me to think and go against my biologically determined beliefs and feelings, I have to be able to freely counteract them, and that must mean that I am something more than a brain and body, something transcendent, namely something like a soul. So the question of the soul is hugely important. It gets into morality, to ethics, which are also not scientific questions. It's true, and it gets into the implications of even something like mental health.
Yeah. Yeah. I would also often tell my students, like, science can tell you what happens when you put a knife into someone, but not whether you should put a knife in someone. It can tell you what happens if you put some sort of, poison in their drink, but not whether you should poison their drink, right? We recognize if you're a doctor cutting someone open for surgery, that's a good use of a knife stabbing someone, not because you just don't like them and you want their stuff. So absolutely, there's deeper questions about reality that really are important. Now, you talked a lot there about free will, and Travis is discussing this idea where he says that there actually is no free will. So you were kind of discussing that a little bit there. How would you kind of come into this conversation, Eric, on just the nature of free will and that it is something that we do have? Obviously, the soul does account for that, and often physicalists and naturalists that say there is no soul, there is no free will. So then where do we go in that sort of conversation? How do we just argue for the soul, therefore there is free will, or is there a case for free will that you make?
So a few things. I like to go about it by just exposing the reductio ad absurdums of denying free will. So for example, I think you said it was Travis. Like, for example, if I were talking to Travis, I would ask, if he believes there's no free will, but if I would assume Travis considers himself to be an intellectual person who is going to go after truth based on the available evidence. But again, note how this assumes a type of rational responsibility, that I am free to analyze and investigate and freely come to my own conclusion. So I guess one of the first questions I would have to ask Travis is, if he believes there's no free will, I can't help but wonder if he thinks he freely came to this conclusion, or it was something he was just determined to believe. If the answer is the latter, then why would I choose to or want to believe something he was simply determined to do and believe? It has no epistemic or intellectual bearing on me. So he could never claim a sense of rational superiority or intellectual integrity for his beliefs that he holds to if he was simply determined. Again, second, you can't hold someone morally responsible for what they do. And on top of that, here's another ironic reductio ad absurdum here. If there is no free will, and Travis wants to convince us of that, note how he is implicitly contradicting his own worldview, because to try and argue there is no free will, he would have to first assume that I have the freedom to listen to him and freely change my mind. But again, if there's no free will, then it's all pointless to even discuss the issue. And I think intuitively, we know we do have free will, and thus we choose to freely discuss these kind of issues.
Yeah. Okay. So, hey, Travis, if you want to call in, feel free to call in and actually have a deeper conversation, or be able to kind of push back and ask your questions if you want to here. But before you do that, and before we get to other questions, Eric, I wanted you to address the second point that you were getting to in a little before I stopped you. So kind of as you kind of walk through what is the nature of the soul and what is it, we talked about point number one, that consciousness is not physical. Let's jump to point number two. And again, if anyone else wants to call in or put more questions in the live chat, we'll get to those after this next point. Here you go.
All right, excellent. Okay, so let's go back to the slides here. So if we've established consciousness is not physical, given a logical deduction based on philosophy, because that's what all this stuff is, then we can ask the next question is, okay, what is the thing that grounds and possesses consciousness? And for sure, I know at least one thing is conscious. That's me, I. I am conscious. But then the question is, what kind of thing am I? So here's where we now get a little bit deeper into what's called substance dualism. And we can just define it for our purposes here as a view that I am a soul that has a brain and body. So in other words, I am a soul. I am identical, literally the same thing as my soul. So I have a body, but I don't, quote, have a soul. And it is a case that I am a soul, and a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. And here's where I like to pause and tell the audience that I've actually changed my view here, because I actually do believe we have a soul, because a few years ago I went to the dealership and got a Kia Soul, and I bought that car just so I can make this joke. I literally spend real money just for this. It's a very rich punchline, if you will. And you know, when I was looking for this car, I was soul searching. So, you know, I have to milk it for everything I can, you know, given that that's the reason I bought this car. So
I'm about to kick you off the show right now, Eric.
So if I am a soul and a soul is a material, then it follows that I am immaterial. And if a brain and body are physical, then it follows, again, logical deduction, that I am not identical or reducible to a brain and body. Now, let's suppose that I were. Let's suppose there is no soul and physicalism is true. Well, if that's the case, then we would have to say that I am identical to a brain and body if there is no soul. The I would be just that. Well, if that's the case, then human beings would be what are called mereological aggregates. We can just call it aggregates for short. What does that mean? It's a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So things like watches, cars, or Lego bricks are what you call aggregates. Now, it's important to understand that for aggregates, their existence and identity, what they are, depends on the structure and their parts. So here's a quick thought experiment. Take a tricycle. A tricycle is what it is in virtue of the fact that it has three wheels. But if we were to remove one of the wheels of a tricycle, then we can say, in a real sense, metaphysically speaking, a bicycle has ceased to exist and a tricycle has come into existence. Now, what this tells us is simply that for aggregates, they don't maintain identity through change or part replacement. So here's another thought experiment. This is typically comes from what's called the ship of Theseus, but I'm going to use a car as an illustration. To push this point further, take this car, and I want the audience to ask themselves, if I replace the tires of this car, would it be the same car? Now, whatever your answer is, let's push it further. Suppose I now replace every single nut and bolt on this car. You know, the windshield, the bumper, every screw, everything you can think of, gave it a nice little shine. Now we can ask, is it the same car? But before we answer that question, push it one more step further. And suppose I take those replaced parts I just took off and put those back together. Well, now we have two cars. And the question is, which of these two is the original, if any? And regardless of your answer, I think one thing is clear, and that's they both cannot be the original. And again, what this shows us is that for aggregates, they do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. Okay, so with this in mind, here's the first argument. It's the argument from identity through change. So premise one, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Two, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. So here's, again, a thought experiment. Which of these am I? Well, it's going to depend on whether or not I maintain identity through change. Am I the same person from one moment to the next? Well, suppose I commit a crime 7 to 10 years ago, and they just now find the evidence. We know scientifically that virtually every 7 to 10 years, your body will replace almost every cell. Well, I committed a crime 7 to 10 years ago, but they just now find the evidence. And then I get a knock at my door from a detective, and he says, hey, Eric, we just found the evidence to convict you. Now, imagine if I told him, I said, look, Jay, you know that we're just brains and bodies. And so the person you're looking for actually isn't here because that was a different set of properties and parts. So go find that guy, but good luck, he doesn't exist. Obviously, he's going to say, well, no, we're going to have to take you in. And he's going to slap the cuffs on me. Why? Because we do know that I do maintain identity through change or part replacement. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. I'll give one more argument in this vein, and this is from an atheist philosopher, Jaegwon Kim. He put it this way: in 2001, this brain and body did not exist. However, I did exist in 2001. Therefore, I'm neither identical nor reducible to my brain and body.
That's good. And I think that's very easy. And I would often use that sort of argument with my students. In fact, I would show them a different video of yours based on that. And again, I think I'm looking at the live stream as the live comments as you're talking. I think there's some misunderstanding here. And I think what he's saying here, Travis, is what you're writing there. You say a human is an aggregate. The human loses a physical hand in a car accident. Did he lose anything non-physical? Well, no. The question is this: if you are merely an aggregate and you are equal to your body, and you lost your hand, then you would be different. Are you a different person? Or did you maintain identity as Travis, even though now part of your physical body is gone? If you did maintain identity as you are still Travis before you lost the hand, and you are Travis after you lost the hand, then your identity as who you are, Travis, cannot be equal to your physical body, because when your physical body changed, you didn't. You as a person, your fundamental identity, you are now Travis without a hand. And that's the whole point of this conversation about aggregates, is this identity through change. Now, someone mentioned last week, Eric, that Tom Jump had restreamed my interview with him. And I know that you had a conversation with him as well, where he kind of made the same sort of argument of I am equal to my body. And as my body changes, I change. And it's like, well, how many Toms have I been talking to throughout this conversation?
That's right.
And so I think that's a fundamental question, is this deeper understanding of who am I, and do I maintain that identity throughout change? Would you say anything else to this idea of changing physical bodies, or kind of to what Travis said here about if I lose my hand, what if someone says, no, I am different. I'm now Ryan without a hand. So I am different.
I would say it's absurd, and I saw some of the questions she was asking in the live chat, and it would be important to carefully pay attention to what I'm saying, because even some of what he's saying is showing that he's not keeping track of what I'm arguing. Right, if someone's going to bite the bullet and say, okay, yes, I am a different person, well, then you are literally not the same person from one moment to the next. So the police analogy I just used, well, if that's the case, then Travis could, in his view, if it's correct, could literally commit a crime and then 7 to 10 years later claim that it wasn't him, and he would be correct. Now, I think we can all see how intuitively false and just wrong that would be, but that would be an implication of his view. Same thing where, if he got his hand chopped off, then yeah, sure. I hope Travis isn't married, because, if he just clips his nails, well, then he's a new person and now no longer married to the woman he's with, because it's a different person. The reductio ad absurdum examples can be given ad nauseum, and it would just simply be one of those views where, yeah, you're going to have to admit you're not the same person from one moment to the next, and the implications there, I think, speak for themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So now, Paul, thanks for being here, Paul. Sorry, it's taking a while for me to get to your question, but I think this idea, Eric, of that we're not our physical bodies, and as our brain and our bodies change, it doesn't change us, but we also recognize there is a deep connection between our brain and the effects on the brain, and then how that affects us. And so, kind of relating to that a little bit, Paul asked this question. It says, we know that the mind is a product of the brain, and this can be tested as drugs affect the mind. There is a mind, the mind is a product of the brain, true or false? And so how do you argue? I think Travis put something similar, this idea of we know that our minds, our mental state is physical, because you can give physical drugs to your physical brain and it can affect your mind.
Yeah. So Travis may have came in. Paul, you said?
Paul.
He may have come. Yeah. He may have come in late. So that's something I addressed early on. But suffice to say this, and this is another part in my longer presentation that I give, but I can sum it up here. Note my argument is simply that my mind is not identical or reducible to the brain. That's different than saying a quote-unquote byproduct. That's a separate question. But even if we just grant what Paul said is true, that's not an objection to my argument. It could still be the case that the mind is not identical or reducible to the brain. Additionally, if Paul is going to say it's just a byproduct, well, then you have two things here existing. You have a brain and then a quote-unquote byproduct. So there are two entities at play. And if that's the case and it's still non-physical, then Paul would have to be at the very least a property dualist, which is a view that, yes, I'm a quote unquote physical substance, according to property dualism, but my mind is a non-physical entity. So none of that would show anything or be an objection to what I said. On top of that, cause and dependence does not prove identity. To reiterate for those listening, identity means the same thing as in philosophy. So if I can show a cause or dependence relation between my mind and brain, which, by the way, no substance dualist denies this, which is odd to me when non-believers or physicalists bring this up as if it's some profound epiphany that we have just now learned in the past 10 years or something. Even cavemen knew that if you hit me over the head really hard, it's going to make me go dizzy. So to show a correlation between the mind and brain is in no way an objection to dualism. It's actually expected and predicted on dualism. Moreover, if I were to play a guitar and as I'm playing it, you begin to detune my strings, you have demonstrated a cause and effect or dependence relation between the music I want to play and a properly functioning working guitar. But note that just because you've showed an established a dependency or cause and effect relation, it doesn't prove that therefore I am a guitar. It doesn't prove therefore the note C is inside of the guitar. All you've shown is a cause and effect relation or dependence relation between the two. So yeah, none of that's an objection. And I'll say one more thing. Sometimes, and I could almost bet money this is going to come up. What some physicalists or non-believers will say is, well, show me a mind without a brain, as if that's my argument. One, that's not my argument, but here's the other thing I like to push back with. Before I show you a quote-unquote mind without a brain, let's start here. Show me a mind first. Now, what people will typically do is they'll point to brain firings, and I just repeat my question, and I'll say, well, I didn't ask you to show me a brain. I asked you to show me a mind. You can't show me a mind. As I've heard Moreland say, a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he can never know more about my mental life than I do. Because while he's able to crack open my skull and see my brain, he's never going to see my thoughts. So yeah, I would love for anyone to just show me a mind before we can even try to attempt to show a quote unquote mind without a brain.
Yeah. So how then, or how do I want to do this is, what would be, let me actually say this. This is what I was thinking at the beginning is probably a bad analogy, or every analogy breaks down at some point, but I often use it, and I'm curious what you think, the analogy of like my phone and then like the cloud, right? Now the cloud is just actually a bunch of computers somewhere and they're physical, so it doesn't match in that sense. But the idea of is my ability to access information on the cloud is dependent on my phone functioning properly. If you break my phone, I no longer have access to the cloud. Now, does that mean that my phone is the cloud? No, not at all. But there is absolutely a dependent relationship there. We're not talking about identity relationships, as you mentioned. The phone is not the cloud, but my phone is necessary to access it. So in a similar way, you have a mind and you have a brain, and the brain is necessary. You need the brain to access the mind, and therefore you do brain damage, and there's a limitation and there's a brokenness there. But that in no way is evidence that the brain is the mind, when we've looked at these other arguments from the law of identity and what you talked about there of aggregates and things of that nature. Is that a fair way of explaining it? Would you add or take away anything from that, Eric?
No, that's fair. You can also just point to the information of the cloud, right? The information that you're trying to download from that cloud is not physical. I'll have to plug in my light in a second. But the phone is physical, but not the information. Some people have used a Wi-Fi and router. Yeah, same concept. You have something that is stored on something external to itself, or something that's not itself. And the point simply here is that they're not identical.
Yeah. So what would you, what came in a couple of weeks ago in a conversation was this idea of like, and I've heard this a lot of like the brain and the mind is like the computer and then the computer screen, or it's like the hardware and it's the software. I'm sure you've heard this before and you just got covered up. But I'm just curious how you would respond to this idea when you get done plugging that light bulb in, of the computer hardware versus software, or the computer stuff and then the screen, if you can still hear me. All right. Yeah, there you are. You are back.
Yeah. Okay. So, so interestingly, this is also what you just described. There are actually views named after this. There's like a hardware view, and then there's a software view of the philosophy of mind. And essentially, what people would have to argue, again, if people are going to argue like software, hardware, then again, they're dualists of some sort, even if it's just property dualism, because they are admitting that there are two things at play. On top of that, again, all we're arguing so far is that the two are not identical, and that's all we need. Now, if someone wants to be a strict physicalist and say it's just all physical, well, they're going to have to show that both the hardware and the software are something physical. But I would love to see an argument there, but I think it's just shown easily that they're not the same thing and they're not identical or reducible to the other. Even if they're dependent or caused by, that's still not an objection to what we're arguing.
Yeah. All right. So I want to jump in here really quickly. I think I cut you off before you got into your next point on the fact that we are not our brain. And you talked about aggregates and that law of identity. I think there's also the value and what that means for human value is maybe the second point you're going to get into, if I'm guessing correctly, based on other stuff I've seen of yours. But was there something else there you wanted to get into on that second point of we are not equal to our brain?
No, we can go to another argument if you want.
Okay, sure. Go for it.
I don't. When you said equal, yeah. Let's just go to another argument. I think I get at what you're talking about. Yeah, let me know when those slides are up.
They are up.
Okay, so let's go to another argument, and it would be the argument from the indivisibility of personhood. So again, this is to the second point. I am not my brain and body. So premise one, same thing as before. I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Two, purely physical objects can be divided and exist in percentages or degrees. So roughly, take the properties of being soft and hard. These are properties that can be divided or exist in percentages or degrees. So something soft can be softer or harder, and sound can be louder or quieter. So these are properties that can fluctuate and change. By contrast, non-degreed properties are the opposite. Cannot be divided, cannot exist in percentages or degrees. So with this in mind, consider that they're all or nothing kind of things. Consider the property of being evenness. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2. This is because evenness is an all or nothing kind of thing. Something is either even or is not even. There is no in between there. So with this in mind, consider, let's apply this to purely physical objects. It would make sense to cut a table in half, burn one side, and say that I have 50% of a table. But it would make no sense to say that if I were to be cut in half, say my limbs were severed, it makes no sense to say that I am 50% of a person. Now note, I can have 50% of a body, but that doesn't mean therefore I am 50% of a person. And I like to put it this way. If our personhood is something grounded in the physical, then the question becomes this. Does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? Because if we attribute value and intrinsic worth to persons, and if I'm nothing more than a brain and body, then personhood is going to be degreed or non-degreed, and if I'm purely physical, it's going to have to be degreed, which means having more mass and matter would mean that I, quote-unquote, matter more. Or consider that men are typically larger than women. What does that mean, that men are more valuable or more persons than women? No, of course not. Well, what this would imply is that, again, I am not identical or reducible to my brain and body. Now, some people might say, well, it's the brain that matters, but no, same problem. There have been operations or even conditions where people are born with only 70% of a brain, or operations where people have 30% of their brain removed. Does this make them 70% persons? No, they're still 100% valuable persons, but they've just maybe lost functioning, but they don't lose personhood. So, premise 3, I cannot be divided or exist in percentages or degrees. I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. 5, therefore, I'm a soul.
All right, good. Yeah, I want to leave that up here for a second because I think that is helpful of this idea. Now, this is what you talked about a second ago of going into much deeper metaphysical, but also just ethical issues, right? Of that we are valuable human beings, not because of how big, strong, tall,
right.
fast, athletic, or whatever we are, that our value, we have this intrinsic value that is grounded in the fact that we are human beings, that we have a soul and it's not divided up. And those are arguments that are often used. That is the argument that is often used for a pro-life position, that just because the unborn is smaller, less developed in a different environment, or is dependent on someone else, does not in any way take away their value, because children are smaller than adults, but still valuable. Children are less developed than adults, still valuable. You can lose arms, you're still valuable. And so, I mean, that is the fundamental argument, I think, that is so important here. And I think the point that comes to mind for me is, this is what people then use to try to argue for human value, right? Like, you see in culture this idea that we are valuable and therefore we have rights, but without something to ground that value, we're valuable based on what? What is it that makes us valuable? And so I think it's interesting that within kind of this naturalistic or physicalism or whatever, where human value would be reducible based on size or level of development or these different issues, yet at the same time, we're arguing for the opposite, that we have equal human rights. The question is, how are we equal without something like this? And so we kind of want the end result, so to speak, but we don't have something deeper to ground it on, which is what this gives you. Okay, so I think I'm trying to think of where exactly I want to go next with this. How then do you kind of put it for individuals that wanted to say, like, look, I am valuable because I'm human. I don't need a soul for this. It's just I'm a human, and therefore that is where this value comes from, not because of arms or size or that sort of thing. It's just my humanness.
Yeah. So great question. So note that the argument is on the indivisibility of personhood. So every human being is a person. That's a property we possess, personhood. So yes, and amen, we are all human. Whether you're an atheist or believe in the soul or not, you're still a human person. The question that we're getting at is that deeper ontological metaphysical issue, namely, what is a thing that grounds it? What kind of thing am I? So remember, my second point is essentially the question, what am I? When I use the word I, that's an indexical word, and that means it's a word that refers to something. So here and there are indexical words. When I use the word I, what am I referring to? Am I referring to a brain, a body, a combination of those two? Or am I, in my view, substance dualism, I am a soul? When I say the word I, am referring to me, the self, the soul. But if, again, you're reducible to brain and body, then your personhood would have to be grounded in something physical. And given that the physical can fluctuate or change, that would therefore imply that your personhood can fluctuate or change. And as you articulated well, if that's the case, then our degree of value or worth is going to have to fluctuate and change based on the thing we're going to ground that personhood in.
Yeah. So, yeah. And so that's where I think it's hard is, and Travis, I think what you're maybe alluding to here, I don't know. But this idea of, if it's not grounded in this deeper nature of who we are, is this intrinsic value, then it becomes, it seems, just the opinion of people based on what that standard is and where that line is. If you want to talk about the pro-life debate, it's it becomes at first breath, or it becomes at consciousness, or it becomes at your ability to feel pain, or it becomes at, and the issue is, well, why is that the line? And when someone else comes along later on and says, well, you're not the right race, or you're not the right gender, or you're not the right age, or you're not the right whatever, or you have a disability, physical or mental disability, therefore you're less valuable. Why is their line wrong? Is it just because culture has agreed that this is where our line is? Well, then go over to Nazi Germany and they had a very different line. Were they just different, or were they actually wrong for putting the line where they did and saying it's the Aryan race that gives you value? If you are disabled or Jew or whatever, then you're not, and we're going to treat you like rats. And so there is that kind of ad absurdum that you're talking about, but we've seen it applied in real life of where people get taken advantage of, and why there's something unique to this sort of view. Now, with that, idea of value, I just made the point and then my question slipped my mind. I should have written it down. The person, what was the question I had? It was so good. I don't remember what my question was, Eric. Now I'm just lost.
I'm not sure, but we could say, just to reiterate, the people, if they want to call in, I would just love to talk to someone. I know, especially if I forget the guy who you're talking to, that's commenting, I would love to talk to him if he's willing to come in. And I
Yeah,
know he
Travis, if
said
you want to
that,
come in really quick, or Paul, if you want to
yeah.
call in, I know we always have a good conversation. You brought this up too, Paul.
Yeah.
Sorry, go for it, Eric.
Well, I was just going to say, because it seemed like Travis was saying that he can't right now or something, but he's commenting nonstop. I'm flattered, but I'd love to have a conversation over the phone. That'd be a lot more productive.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's what I have enjoyed the last few weeks of you guys calling in and having good conversations with you. So, all right. So as I try to figure out what it was what question I had that slipped out of my brain there for a second, what
To not slip out of your brain.
Sorry, I had to. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it again. Are there other arguments that you have? So here's the main ones that I've heard. Are there other arguments? I'm jumping in and we're chatting between each one. Are there other things that you have here and kind of how you would argue for this idea? Oh, here is a caller, and it is Travis. All right, here we go. Let's remove you out. Travis, thanks for calling in. Thanks for engaging. And tell us, or what question do you have for Eric? Or what point do you want to make? I do not hear you, Travis.
His soul has left his body.
Let's see. Interview guest. You're not muted. You should be there. I'm not sure. Hello, Travis. You there? Well, he said 1 second. He'll be right back. All right. While we wait for Travis to come back, were there other arguments that you had or points that you want to make that you think is valuable, or maybe big objections? Or here's Travis again. All right. Let's see if it works this time around. Travis, hey. There you are. All right. Thanks for calling in, Travis. What is it that you want to chat about?
All right. So I just don't see the point in needing to create a word like soul. I think if you're not starting from a base of Christianity being true, like you wouldn't get there naturally, like looking at the evidence. Like we have neurons in a brain burning ATP, creating a network that then generates a thing we call consciousness, or me, or I am. That's all taking place within the brain. You can cut your hand off, you're losing a part of your physical body, you're lowering your weight, etc. But you're only losing the feeling between your hand and your brain there. And so like in some ways you're less intact, but your brain is still real. I just don't see what the point of adding the soul is if you're only looking for scientific evidence to get there. I think it just seems to be like a religion is true and this religion contains this soul concept. So now how do we get there from there? So I don't really think like this
Can I jump in here, Travis?
Eric's like point of view at all. Yeah.
Can you tell me which of my arguments used Christianity and said therefore soul?
Right, like you don't have to actually say that, but I don't think you'd be making these arguments if you weren't a Christian.
So your answer is none of my arguments, correct?
Yeah, like
okay.
your argument that consciousness is not physical, that's kind of like a Christian argument because you're saying God is non-physical.
Can you do me a favor? It'd be a much better productive if you didn't try to psychoanalyze me and just address the arguments.
Sorry. I mean, I know you.
Well, Travis, this is what I addressed in the live chat where I said I talked to a philosopher of neuroscience, or you said you're talking about T. Jump, and I said, well, I talked to a philosopher of neuroscience who addressed all of T. Jump's arguments, and then your question back to me was he a Christian? Right, and that's irrelevant to the conversation. And if you're going to say, well, he's a Christian, therefore he's wrong, that's like a poisoning the well. That's a genetic fallacy. The question is, what arguments did he make? And yes, a Christian is going to argue for a soul. We believe in souls, but it's not we believe in a soul because we're a Christian. Maybe it's I'm convinced there's a soul, and maybe there's a good reason that Christianity is true. And so the question is, what arguments are we making that, and where's the hole in that argument?
All right. Well, consciousness is physical. There's the hole.
Can you prove it?
What evidence do you have for that?
Well, like, are you defining consciousness as like the ability to send thoughts out of the brain to muscles?
No.
Well, like what are you defining consciousness as then?
So I would define consciousness ostensibly, which means you point to instances, and there are 5 states of consciousness. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will.
Okay. And those all take place like on neuronal connections in the brain?
They take place in the mind.
Well, where does the mind take place?
There is no where. It's a non-physical thing, but it's a faculty of my soul.
Okay, so like one in a scientists say that there's certain areas of the brain that light up that are engaged in certain kinds of tasks, like me being able to recognize that Ryan has a face right now. Like
Hmm.
that's a certain segment
Absolutely.
in my brain that's lighting up, right?
Yep, that's right. Just like I can show you what keys on a piano are correlated with what notes that I want to play in the song.
Right. So then we're not really talking about a mind, we're talking about a brain.
No, we're okay. So, no. So when I talk about music, I'm not talking about a piano, but I may need a piano to play music. And I want to address another point you said earlier. So you're accusing earlier of saying we just do this because we're Christians and that's why we're trying to get there. One is, even if that were true, that wouldn't make the evidence false. Two, why do you think there are atheists who are substance dualists and believe in the soul? There are neuroscientists who are dualists and believe in the soul. There are people who are not Christian and not religious and believe in the soul. What do you think their motivation is if you're assuming this is just because we're Christians?
I mean, like most people aren't dualists, and then
Actually,
they
yeah.
don't make.
Most people, yes, they are. Most people around the world are dualists.
Oh yeah, most people are theists, I guess. Yeah.
I said dualist.
But being a theist would most likely entail a dualist as well. So if you have 2 billion Christians around the world that are dualists, then you have a lot of dualists in the world as well. But that, Travis, so that still doesn't address the question is if non-Christian neuroscientists, philosophers are also dualists, what reason would they have? Or is it possible that there
Well,
actually
you
are
you
good philosophical reasons
you
for
you kind
substance
of
dualism?
you kind of assumed my whole argument there. I was asking if he was a Christian because I saw one of the videos you did with a neuroscientist.
Okay.
I think, like an Indian guy's name. I forget his
I
like.
did an interview with, Maritu Gupta.
Was that the guy you were talking about?
That was one of them. Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, I did watch that, and I was asking if he was Christian because that would have like confirmed for me that was the guy you're talking about.
Okay.
And I just didn't think that guy really answered T Jump's kinds of questions well. I
Okay.
mean, he
Fair
tried to
enough.
answer them, but I just heard like a lot of word salad and not real concrete stuff.
Okay.
So,
So
Um,
Travis, do you have an
go ahead.
argument, or because well, what I'm hearing, ironically, is what you're accusing of is word salad. I haven't heard yet an argument against the soul.
okay, so I'm saying we have a brain, we have this network of neurons. That's all.
Hmm.
Like you can't say that doesn't exist. And then for
Who said
some
that?
reason you're calling that a mind, and I
No, no,
don't
I'm
see
not
the
calling the
point
brain a
why.
mind. No, I've
Okay,
never
so
called the brain the mind.
what does the brain's role have to do with the five like emotions that you were talking about before?
While I'm embodied, they're correlated with that, just like the notes or key, just like the keys on a piano are correlated with the notes of a song.
They're correlated with it. What does that mean?
Uh, what the basic definition of correlated
So
means?
so you're saying like they're not actually doing anything, they're just reacting to like the soul's messages?
No, they're correlated with. There's a causal relation. I wouldn't even mind if you wanted to say dependence relationship. I would even admit that while embodied. But again, just like when I touch the keys on a piano, is it doing something? Of course it is. But does it follow that therefore the note C is just the keys of the piano? No. You would agree with that, right?
Note C is the key of the piano.
Yeah, the note C is not 3 keys on a
Like
piano or 2 keys on a
I
piano.
just I don't really like talking about this in an analogy kind of way. Like the
Okay, well,
brain
let's
is
just talk about
physical.
music.
It No, let's
But
just
let's
talk
start there,
about the
though.
brain. Let's talk about the brain because that's what I'm talking about. So the brain
Hmm.
is physical. It has a
Yes.
network of
Hmm.
cells pushing energy around, right?
Hmm.
And where does the soul interact with that?
So no, let's focus on one thing at a time. You're changing the subject. We're talking about correlations, and I'd like to stick to the piano analogy. Is a note C the same thing as keys on a piano? Yes or no?
No. The note C
Okay.
is a tone.
Right. So you
It
do
describes
then
how
get
air
the
moves over time.
right.
Yeah.
So you can grasp the concept of two things being correlated but not identical, correct?
Yeah, the tone is a concept. The piano
Okay.
is a physical thing.
Whatever you want to call it. So now apply that to the mind and brain. Same concept.
Okay, so the sound that the piano makes is physical, and we can call that physical thing a note, which is a concept.
Notes aren't concepts. I wouldn't call sound physical, but regardless, my point being here is now if we apply this to the brain, are you saying that the mind just is the brain?
I'm just saying the brain is the brain. There's no reason to add the mind to it.
Do you have a mind?
You could say the brain being in non-state, like some kind of consciousness, some kind of energy, some kind of like normalness to it of like a living person, and that's your soul, but it's still like just like an abstract word on top of like what we can already describe.
So Eric, let me jump in here really quickly. If you mentioned, okay, so a thought is something that is in the mind, what would be the consequence, or what would be the result if our thought really is just in our brain and there's not our thoughts are not in our mind? If it is just the brain and the chemicals of the brain producing our thoughts, as the thought is just a product of the brain, what is there an issue there? Is there a problem there? Why are you saying that we need to separate that out and say no, thoughts are in the mind, not the brain?
Well, I mean, many things. The first problem would be that there's no evidence for that. The second would be that you'd be going against logic and the law of identity. Third, you would say that if the mind just is the brain, but it sounds like Travis is saying there is no mind. I want to ask him about that later. But if the mind just is the brain, then I should be able to look at a brain and see thoughts. But clearly,
yes, you can.
Neuroscientists do not do that.
You can do that.
So Travis, this is a conversation I had with Tom Jump, and I know that Eric did as well. And Tom agreed in a sense. You cannot look using a brain scan at someone's brain activity. You cannot see the lighting up of their brain and know what their thought was.
Yes,
thought is no, you can't. There's no fMRI that you say, okay, if you stuck me in a scanner and I laid there, and you said, okay, think about something, and you said, think about something, Ryan, and then they see a part of my brain light up. They can't know I was thinking about the beach, or I was thinking about eating steak, or I was thinking about something else.
Tom literally said in that example that he can tell you what you're going to think about 8 seconds in advance.
Only after the person has first reported it. That's what my discussion was with Marita Gutta, is if you could, and Tom said this in my conversation with him, if you could map out the brain, you first would have to create a map by asking someone, what are you thinking? And then they can correlate, or they can try to connect that spot with their thought.
I understand. Okay. I understand what you're trying to do here. You're saying like we might just have like the very slender definition of what someone's thinking about, but not the entire thing.
I would say, I don't know, Eric, if you know more on this, but I would say that you can't know anything. You can know that they are thinking, but there's not a knowledge of what the thought is.
But you can see the patterns there, right?
Okay, but let me ask you this, because I still want to go back to...
You can see the patterns repeat each time you think of the same thing. Like, this is how, like... But
hold on, Travis. Works. Hold on, Travis. We're not talking about patterns. We're talking about the difference between thoughts and brain activity. Eric has a quick comment, though.
Do you believe that you are conscious?
Yes.
Okay, so you believe in a mind, correct?
No.
Explain that for me.
Consciousness is a property that brains have.
Okay, but that would be your mind.
No,
even if you want to say that.
Mind for no reason. Yeah, that would be my mind, but it's still like on my brain.
Okay, so it's in your brain. So if you were to cut up on my skull right now, you could see my thoughts?
No, that's not how it works.
Right. You know why? Because your thoughts are not in your brain.
if I installed electrodes in your brain that could measure the patterns in your brain, and then you could repeat those patterns, you can control a mouse or a computer or a video game, just as Elon Musk's Neuralink has done.
Therefore, what, Travis?
Therefore, the patterns are reproducible, and you can make your thoughts are physical.
Yeah. Okay. So explain that logical jump you just made. What you said is you can basically stimulate thoughts by stimulating my brain. No one disagrees with that. Just like I can stimulate music by stimulating the keys on a piano. And then you say, therefore, the mind or consciousness is in the brain or the brain. How did you make that jump there?
Well, how are you detecting non-physical things? What would these sensors
No,
be detecting if they're not physical?
I don't want to accuse you of intentionally dodging, but I want you to stick to just one thing at a time. How did you make the logical jump from A can cause B, therefore A is the same thing as B?
Okay, so thoughts can cause electrodes to pick up a pattern. Therefore, thoughts, I mean, like how would thoughts like not interact with the electrode then? Like it would have to be physical.
Okay, so a thought is a state of mind or a state of consciousness. Are thoughts physical?
Yes, it's like a
Okay.
connection of energy in the brain.
Okay, so you're telling me that you're telling me you just said thoughts can stimulate neurons in the brain. So you're essentially saying that energy in the brain can stimulate energy in the brain.
Yes, that's how it works.
Okay, so how do you know which is which? How do you know which is a thought and which is what the thought is stimulating?
Thoughts stimulate other thoughts. Like this is the semantic stuff that I hate when you do this, Eric. It's just not like a good way to debate.
Exposing that you're using a tautology or that your argument isn't getting anywhere isn't me using semantics in a debate. There's these words are specific for a reason.
Yeah, it's specific that you're adding mind to a physical brain for no reason.
Can we call it consciousness?
No.
Travis, can I just ask this? Because this is where I'm doing this whole conversation, right? And this is part of, and what triggered this is the series that I'm going through, Armin Navabi's book on why there is no God. And one of the constant themes every chapter is this idea of you're just doing this for no reason, or you're doing this for no evidence. We walk through the first 20 or 30 minutes of this show giving evidence and reasons for why we think the soul is real. Namely,
it's not evidence.
Because you have a very strict understanding of evidence being only that which is scientific, but our previous conversations in the past, you have reasons and beliefs that you have that are not also scientific. So we've given philosophical arguments.
Really,
hold on, Travis.
Those are words you put in my mouth. But
anyone go back and you said that you have a belief that there is no God, and that belief did not fall into your novel testable prediction test that you use to test whether things are true or false. And so we did recognize at least that you do have a belief that hasn't been tested in that sense. Now, maybe that's beside the point.
It's not really about God as an entity that I can test. It's about people being able to make up stories, which I can test.
Sure, people can make up stories, but that's irrelevant to what we're talking about here. The question is
that's what God is, a made up story.
That's a jump, right? Just because some people make up stories, you then have to show the logical connection. I don't know, category error, but no, you have to show the logical connection why this is a made up story. So you can't say some people lie, therefore you're lying. No, that doesn't follow logically. And so that's what we're trying to address here. The point though is when you say you've made this jump to a soul for no reason after we've gotten done giving a bunch of reasons, and it's saying, can you at least interact with our reasons? Why do you think our reasons are not good reasons?
Like you need to ground the reasons in what actually physically exists, and you guys are just telling me that.
Can I pause there,
that
Travis?
Consciousness is more confusing than like a physical brain. I can give you that, but it's not a place where you can put God in.
Thus far for God, no one is saying. I've never said the brain is more complicated than we think. None of that's my argument. Because you're straw manning. But let's start one thing at a time. Why is what we presented not evidence?
you still like you just like immediately forget that the brain is composed of neurons, and then you move on to the mind, and then you make a
Okay,
bunch of
so
analogies about the mind. Like
let's clarify.
you
Let's
need
clarify,
you need to compare,
Travis.
you need to use neurons in your explanation of what a
Okay,
soul is.
all right, here we go. All right, let's do that. Let's do that.
So here, really
Let's
quickly,
clarify
just
that.
so we all know, there's another caller that just came in, and so Travis, you've had a lot of time. We walked through a lot, so let's kind of wrap this up, and then we'll jump to the next caller.
Yeah, I mean, we're
Okay.
just really getting started, but okay.
Okay. My thoughts are correlated with neurons, but my thoughts and neurons are not the same thing. They're not identical or reducible to each other because my thoughts can be true or false, but my neurons are not true or false.
Okay, I mean, it's just you can still reduce that all down to neurons, though.
But he just
Okay.
gave an argument why it's not. Your neurons cannot be true or
Like,
false. Your thoughts can be true or false. Therefore, your thoughts and neurons do not
exist
share
or they
an
don't
idea.
exist.
That's not what we're saying here. Is whether we all agree neurons exist. Can a neuron be false?
I don't know what that means.
Exactly. It's pointless.
Exactly.
Can a thought be false? A thought can be false. A neuron can't be false. Therefore, a thought and neuron does not share an identity relationship. Therefore, they are not the same thing.
Right. It's an emergent phenomena on top of the real.
That's fine.
cells.
That's fine. So you're now a proper dualist. Welcome to the team. I appreciate the call.
But
all right, Travis.
But it's just a net, like a software program on top of the physical substrate.
So we've addressed the software program thing. I'm sorry, we've given you a lot of time. We've talked about the software program before. I was addressing that because you brought that up in the comments, and so we'll have to go back to that point. So
you failed to address it.
Okay. Well, we'll maybe address it here in a little bit. But hey, Travis, appreciate it, but we have to end soon. We talked about that, and we'll address it there if you don't think it was faithfully addressed. So, Travis, I do appreciate you coming. I do appreciate your questions. I do appreciate the calls we had in the past and this one as well. So thanks for being here. All right. Next caller here. Micah has a tough one here for Eric. Micah, thanks for coming to the show.
Yeah, thanks. Love to pick your brain on this, Eric.
I'm just going to hang up on this guy right here.
No, okay. So question on whether knowledge is intrinsically valuable. You do take the position that knowledge is intrinsically valuable. And so how would you respond to someone that says, well, we don't teach little kids everything. We withhold information on purpose from them to protect, maybe their minds or something like that. There's information that is harmful to our own, human or our own mental health that we don't necessarily want to be exposed to. And so therefore knowledge is not something that is intrinsically valuable.
Yeah, I would say it's a non sequitur. It doesn't lead to the other. We can say on the one hand, knowledge is intrinsically valuable, and on the other hand, say, and there's some knowledge we should withhold from certain people. So neither of these two things they're not mutually exclusive.
Then how would you define intrinsically valuable?
It's a good in and of itself, but whenever we're talking about moral values or just values in general, there are some values that may compete against each other. And when two values compete against each other, you're going to have to appeal to the weightier moral value, if you will. So, for example, even within ethics, right? As believers, we would say it's not ethical, it's not morally right to lie. But suppose you're a doctor or you're in the ambulance, you're a medic, and someone just got shot. It looks really bad. And they can't look down. Let's say something's wrong with their neck. And you know that if you don't get them to the hospital and keep them calm till you get there, they're going to die. And then they look at you and say, tell me, how bad is it? Am I okay? I would say the moral thing to do in that situation would be to lie in order to not elevate his heart rate and get him all anxious and make his blood pressure go up, because that would kill him. So I think in that situation, you would be morally obligated to withhold knowledge. And so you have on the one hand, knowledge is intrinsically good, and on the other hand, you should do your best to preserve life. And when those two things compete, the life is going to be the thing you're going to have to appeal to, which is not to say for the next 10 minutes, it's no longer the case that knowledge is not intrinsically valuable, but rather that given that life is more valuable than this piece of knowledge, you would appeal to that value over the other.
So, question then: what would you say is the best argument for why knowledge would be something that is intrinsically valuable?
Well, assuming we're talking to believers, correct?
No, assuming you're talking to a non-believer.
Okay, well then, yeah, that would be a little bit more impacting, but it would essentially be the same. I would just say that because we were designed, we are made to obtain knowledge, and assuming the person is an intellectual or wants to be rational, one of the rules of thumb in epistemology is to believe as many true things as possible and not believe as many false things as possible. And if that's a goal of epistemology, of growing, of learning, then that would add to, or that would lean into knowledge is intrinsically valuable. On top of that, if a person wants to grow in character, grow in wisdom, then that's going to encompass growing in knowledge as well.
Well, so to your last point though, wouldn't that make knowledge extrinsic if you try to run that argument, because now you're saying that knowledge achieves these things and that's why it's valuable?
Well, yeah. So good catch there. What I would have to say then is, because again, assuming that we're talking, hence the caveat, assuming we're talking to someone who wants to be rational and intellectual. In other words, given that, it would be a teleological goal to gain knowledge. But let's suppose you have someone who says, well, no, I don't care to be any of those things. I don't want to, know anything or whatever. Well, then that's where I would appeal back to a teleological and something teleological and say, where you are made to function, to grow in knowledge, and when you're not doing that, you are not engaging in the way you were made. But obviously, that's going to assume a designer, which is why I think, anything that has any type of value is going to have to ground it in God in some way or another. So it would just kind of depend at that point on who I'm talking to. That would depend on what route I take to answer that.
Yeah. Okay. So then, for the believer, would it be a similar argument?
Oh, and yeah, for the believer, yeah, I'd be more aggressive and point to scripture and similarly say that you were designed and created to obtain this. Proverbs says, above all things, gain wisdom and understanding. So we're called to chase after knowledge and wisdom and understanding. It's biblically a mandate for us to do. And I could spend all day just talking about the scripture of it, but for sure, I would point to that.
Yeah. So, okay, and then final question here. If you would have to steel man kind of the other side, which is, knowledge is extrinsic, what would you say that the best argument is? And then what would be your response to that?
Well, it depends what they meant by extrinsic. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, valuable for, valuable to get something else, right? It's an instrumental good, not an intrinsic good.
Well, I think it could be both. Actually, I don't see those as mutually exclusive. I think at its core, it's intrinsically good, because to ever be able to make any decision, choice, to really do anything in life, you have to have knowledge. So I think I would. It would be interesting to see a case that knowledge was purely extrinsic, but I think at its core, it has to start intrinsically, because as I've heard Moreland say, in order to doubt anything, you have to at least know something. So to even doubt requires knowledge. And then I can also agree with the person and say there are times where their knowledge is just a pragmatic means to an end, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, for example, if I was playing a video game and I wanted to learn how to beat this level, I can go gain the knowledge of it. But I wouldn't say that knowledge has somehow grown me in my character or made me a more virtuous person. But I wouldn't mind saying it was extrinsic knowledge as a means to a pragmatic end.
So you would say that there are instances in which knowledge is not an intrinsic good?
Yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Yeah, for sure. Now,
Okay,
depending on where you want to argue that, you could say, well, I'm doing this in order to bring joy into my life, and joy is an intrinsic good. But no, we're no longer talking about knowledge. It would still be the intrinsic knowledge being valuable in itself. It would just be the case that knowledge would be, quote unquote, pragmatically good in order to achieve another intrinsic good, namely joy. But yeah, I wouldn't have a problem saying that they're not mutually exclusive, but I would say that at its core, knowledge is going to be an intrinsic good.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. So have you heard of any good arguments for why it would be extrinsic?
Only from people who deny that there are that morality is objective or truth is objective, because then everything would be pragmatic at that point.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for
Micah.
answering that, man.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one.
Yeah, and just to add, even if he hangs up, he can still hear this. It'd kind of be the same thing with truth. I think truth is objective, but I don't deny that there can be subjective truth. So there wouldn't be mutually exclusive. But truth at its core is going to be objective. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Now, Erica, thanks, Micah. Appreciate it. A question did come in. I don't know if you have any just brief opinions. I know we have to wrap up here in just a couple minutes. If you have brief opinions, one of your thoughts or opinions on either Swinburne's argument for the soul or Plantinga's modal argument for the soul. So I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on either of those two arguments you can share as we wrap up.
I think they're both great. They're similar in kind to what I was talking about with the indivisibility of personhood, or even the first one, the identity through change. Swinburne and Plantinga have, if I'm thinking of the same one, have both argued something similar to where, like, Swinburne says, say, I'm sitting in a chair, and over time you replace, parts of my body, a pacemaker, yada yada, so forth. But it took a long time. Most people would say, well, I'm still the same person. And Swinburne argues, well, what if it happened really fast without killing me? What if, like, rapidly you could change every part of my body? Why does the amount of time it takes to change make a difference as to whether or not I'm the same person? And then argues, if I'm the same with a long amount of time versus a short amount of time, then it must be something more than my brain and body that grounds my identity to change.
Okay. And Plantinga's argument, do you have thoughts on that one?
If now... There's, depending on what they're talking about, because I know Swinburne uses that, Plantinga may even use that, but then there's a different type of modal argument. What's commonly known as a modal argument, I probably should have went there first, is essentially the argument that it's a pretty simple argument that says, I am possibly disembodiable or conceivably disembodiable, but my body is not disembodiable. Therefore, I am not identical or reducible to my body. So essentially, note on that argument, you don't even have to believe that you can be disembodiable. You don't have to believe that you can exist without a body, but just the mere fact that it is conceivable or not logically impossible to say I am disembodiable, but it would be logically impossible to say the body is disembodiable. So that alone would show that there's at least one modal property that I, the self, possesses that my body does not. And then using, again, Leibniz's argument, they're not the same thing.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, what would you say is, maybe if you could just summarize kind of the last hour and 15-minute conversation we've had, what are kind of the big maybe misunderstandings that people have about mind-body dualism? Like, if we can clarify these few things, that would be really helpful to have a more productive discussion and conversation.
Some of the stuff we've already touched on and what we even talked about with the caller, but essentially a dualist, and what I've argued, what we've presented here today, is simply that the mind and brain are not the same thing. They're not identical or reducible to each other, and that I am not identical or reducible to my body. That is all we've argued for thus far. So whether you believe in God or not is not relevant to whether or not a soul exists. Whether you're a Christian or not is not relevant to whether or not the soul exists. And as I explained earlier in the video, just because you can show a cause and effect or dependence relationship between the mind and brain, again, does not show that they're the same thing. All we've argued is that they're not identical or reducible to the other. Now, if that's the case, as I went into the deeper arguments, then I must be something more than a brain and body, namely a soul. On top of that, we've also explained that we don't deny, again, correlations or cause and dependence or influences between the mind and brain, but it is a two-way street, which I mentioned with Jeffrey Schwartz and his OCD patients with cognitive behavioral therapy. On top of that, the argument for the soul does not depend on whether or not a mind can exist without a brain. I think it can, but that's a separate question to what I've argued. Again, we're just simply saying they're not the same thing. Really, if that could simply be understood, that would really help a lot with even the questions people ask about this stuff.
Yeah, wonderful. Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you, Eric. So appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. I know you're busy. You were out last night. You're out about to head out and talk at another event. So thanks for making this time. As always, we love having these chats when we're in Utah or different Maven trips together. And so appreciate you having it on my channel.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you for having me. And if people want to learn more, they can go on my YouTube channel. Just type my name, Eric Hernandez. They can also pick up my book, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. I have some sections responding to naturalism, where I talk about the soul and consciousness and how consciousness is not identical or reducible to the brain. And I go into some more detail there. But yeah, it's always a blessing chatting with you, whether one-on-one in person or over the internet. You're a blessing in my life. So thank you.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. You too, to us and the whole Maven team and myself as well. So thank you. All right, everybody, as we wrap up, hopefully this was encouraging, engaging, thoughtful, challenged you maybe just to think deeper about this conversation, one that is really hard and many Christians just it's tough to wrap our minds around in a sense. So hopefully this has been an encouragement to you. As always, there's videos that are going to pop up over here to help you think well about other issues in culture and the Christian faith and life. Next week, I'll be back with a conversation walking through Armin Navabi's book on why there is no God. I don't actually know what the next chapter is. So you'll have to just check out and wait for that video to come out next week to see what that is. And again, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for the interaction. I really do think this makes the show better, more engaging, more interesting to listen to rather than me and my guest ramble on. So thank you everyone for coming and for your questions and thoughts and calls. Appreciate it. And I will see you again next week. Until then, continue thinking deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. Bye, everybody. See you next time.